When the parents are gone, and you, with maybe your brother or sister, are left to your own devices for a while, things tend to get creepy. Because who knows who waits outside, waiting for this exact moment to find a way inside your home. Welcome back to Unexplained Encounters. I'm your host, Darkness Prevails. Follow me on Twitter at @DarkPrevails, where I've been posting videos and screenshots of the PC and Android version of the Cryptid card game. No idea when that'll come out, though. Today's episode features Home Alone stories. Macaulay Culkin ain't gonna be there to save you either. Send me your scary stories of the unexplained at darkstories.org. And follow and rate my show on Spotify and Apple if you haven't already. Now, let's begin. The Scream from Mr. Cool Guy. It was Sunday, July 21st. Summer was just ending and school was about to start again. Which sucked because I dreaded school. Mostly because I hated waking up early. I'm no morning person. One day my parents went to work, leaving me home alone. I was sitting on the couch watching some YouTube. As I was enjoying some video, I suddenly heard someone cough upstairs. What in the world? I thought as I stood up, trying to listen for it again. Sure enough, another cough came once more. My stomach turned. I then began to hear fast footsteps coming down the stairs, but when I looked, there was no one coming down them. Still, I panicked. Grabbing my dad's handgun, I sat at the corner of my room, waiting for my parents to get back home. Around 9 p.m., both of my parents returned at the same time, as they work at the same place. I felt relieved as I heard the door open. I quickly hid the gun I'd been holding and went back to the couch, trying to act like nothing happened. I'm not sure why I didn't tell my parents about the situation, but I just didn't. I would put the gun back where I found it as soon as my dad wouldn't notice. "What are you still doing out of bed?" my mom asked. I rolled my eyes and went to bed. As I was going up the stairs, it suddenly got very cold, but I decided to ignore it and just head on to bed. I was a little unsettled because of what happened earlier, but I made up some excuses to calm myself down, and I just hit the sheets. At around 3:15 a.m., I woke up to the sound of a chuckle. I thought I was just hearing things, so I closed my eyes and tried to go back to sleep. 10 minutes later, I heard the same chuckle again. But this time, I heard it twice in a row. It had the same tone of voice, like a recording being played. I didn't want to open my eyes, but I had to. The sound was coming from inside my bedroom. I squinted, my eyes just barely open, and what I saw was terrifying. There was a black mass standing in my closet. The outline looked like someone's arms were down by their sides, and their legs were perfectly together. But there were no features on the figure. I don't know why, but I said in an angry but tired voice, "What the heck do you want? I'm not afraid to die, so come on." Really, I'm not sure why I said that, but I tried closing my eyes again. When I opened them once more, the shadow was in a different position. Its upper body was completely bent to the side at a 90-degree angle, while its legs were still standing straight. "What do you want?" I yelled. Then I heard a woman's scream coming from this thing. I have no idea how it didn't wake up my parents. Right after the screaming stopped, it ran at me and just disappeared. It was like it went through me. I never did see that thing again after that. Thank God. But I still do think about that scary situation to this day. I never told my parents, and they never did hear a scream. At least I don't think they did. I'm sure they would have talked about it. Later on, I tried to look into the history of the home. I was curious about this incident. What I could find was mention of a man dying in the house, and I swear as I was reading that, I heard the same exact cough I'd heard last time. it's still here. Too many to count. From no one. This is about what happened to my mom, my brother, and me. My brother was 9 and I was 7. We stayed at my great-grandmother's house over the span of 3 months. She'd lived in that house for about 50 years, and it had been standing long before she was born. It's a very old house. The first time I walked into the house, to the immediate left was my great-grandmother, in her recliner. She spent most of her time in that chair. As soon as I got past the recliner, I was a very small child, so it took a few steps. There was a sea of 3-foot-tall porcelain dolls. Had to be about 30 to 40 of them. They were all very old and took up about half of the living room area. The majority of them were on the floor, just standing there while the others were up on the mantel and shelves. Once I saw this, I was instantly filled with dread and fear. I knew at that moment I was never going to go near or touch those dolls. I loved playing with dolls. I was even carrying one when I walked in. But those dolls were terrifying to me. I hurried over to my mother on the couch, which was next to my great-grandmother's chair but facing her. My brother did the same. I said hi to her, but other than that, I spent most of my first interaction with her trying to avoid looking at the dolls. I felt as if they were all staring daggers into me. Once there was silence, I asked my mom if I could put away my bag. She said our bedroom was on the right in the hallway, and my great-grandmother's was the one straight ahead, with the bathroom on the left. I hurried there with my brother following suit. The moment we got into the room and shut the door, we both turned and looked at each other, whispering, "What is with those dolls?" We almost said it at the exact same time. We sat there for a moment before I spoke up, saying, "No matter what, we shouldn't touch them. I feel like something bad would happen if we do." He nodded in agreement. This was the first time in my life he ever listened to me. After a few minutes, we went back to our mom, who was now in the kitchen, and we asked her what we could do. She pointed us to the TV room. We sat there watching TV for the rest of the day before bed. It was a luxury for us to be able to watch TV. Nothing but old house noises happened during the first few nights. After a few days, it was laundry day. The washer and dryer were in the basement. My mom was the one who did laundry for everyone there. She refused to go into the basement without someone with her, so both of us went along to check it out. She only used the stairs in the kitchen, even though they were narrow with no railing. The only way to turn on the light was with a pull string at the bottom. As she brought down the laundry, she had a few baskets. My brother and I stayed down there, looking around. Staring up from those stairs, you could see everything clearly. Once my mom brought down the last of the laundry, we stuck very close to her. We were looking at the boxes in the room across from us, when we suddenly saw what looked like the silhouette of a person walk back and forth a couple of times, before disappearing. We immediately turned and looked at each other, confirming that we both saw it. My mom finished the first load, and we hurried upstairs. We didn't see it the next few times we went down there. We asked our mom about it, and she told us that was one of the reasons she didn't like going down there. That night, we were playing cards in the room we all shared, listening to Kids Bop, when we heard what sounded like someone walking around in the hallway. My great-grandmother was already asleep for the night. My mom turned down the music ever so slightly and just sat there listening. We all continued to hear it, so she got up and opened the door to look down the hallway, but saw nothing. Once she closed the door and sat back down, we heard it again, as well as seeing a shadow pass under the door. She jumped up and swung the door open to nothing. She closed the door and told us it was time for bed. We each lay down in our spots and went to sleep. This happened every other night, and we eventually got used to it. These two events were the more common occurrences that happened. One of the times I was downstairs with my mom in the basement, I saw two figures going back and forth in the room in front of me. But after a couple of passes, they both stopped, and I could feel them turn and stare right at me. After some time of this staring, my mom broke me out of my trance by closing the dryer door. I rushed right upstairs after that. I've barely mentioned the dolls, but I avoided them as much as possible. The few times I went into the living room with my great-grandmother, I always noticed the dolls would be moved around. This woman couldn't get up on her own, so I know it wasn't her. None of us wanted anything to do with those dolls, so I knew none of us were touching them. And yet, they were moved somehow. I kept my distance from the living room as much as I could, but when I was around my great-grandmother, I noticed she would talk to them. She would say some weird things to them, such as, "You can't do that," or "Leave them alone." She would speak to them in a sort of mumble whisper. This, of course, creeped me out. Sometimes it would be physically impossible for them to have moved from where they were to where they ended up. The main one that moved around had a baby blue dress with a matching bonnet. I had noticed it at the front of the room while I was giving my great-grandmother her lunch. When I went to collect the dishes from her, I noticed it had moved to a shelf in the back left corner of the room, and one with a red dress and bonnet had taken its place. The blue one always moved the farthest, but nearly all of them were changed around every time I went into the living room. Something I forgot to mention is that I was a weird child. I loved watching scary movies with my mom, so that's how we spent some of our nights. The only TV in the house was in the TV room. When we sat and watched our movies, we could always hear things coming from downstairs, things banging around and voices. Sometimes you could even hear full conversations, as if multiple people were down there. We all just did our best to ignore it. There was a night when we were all sitting there watching a movie, and my mom was catching up on some laundry that had piled up. I went down with her into the basement. We could both feel that something was wrong. It felt heavy down there, as if something was pressing down on your shoulders. She was just putting in the detergent, about to close the lid, when I looked into the room across the way, and I saw two figures standing there staring again. I then turned left to look away from them, only to see two more figures standing and staring. I whimpered to my mother after she closed the lid and turned around to see the figures too. I then pointed to the others on the left. She looked and turned back to me. All I saw was horror in her eyes. As she was about to tell me to hurry upstairs, a rattling noise cut her off mid-sentence. We both looked, and we saw boxes in both rooms shaking just before they flew out right towards us. We nearly fell trying to run up those stairs. She never did laundry at night after that. About a week afterwards, with the only occurrences being the walking in the hallway and dolls moving around, I was home alone one day. My mother was taking my great-grandmother to an appointment. I don't recall where my brother was, though. It was around noon. I was lying on the couch watching TV when I heard a weird shuffling noise. Of course, it was coming from the basement. I did my best to ignore it, until it got so loud that it drowned out the noise of the TV. I finally gave in, and I went to the stairs to look down. All I saw was darkness, but the noise seemed to be coming from the bottom of the steps. Simultaneously, the remote flew from the couch and hit the wall. As I looked towards the noise, I got shoved down the stairs. I landed at the bottom, nearly uninjured. I believe that turning to see the remote fly is the only thing that saved me from landing head first at the bottom. Once I was down there, disoriented and a little sore, I could hear laughing from all around me, moving around. I was so scared that I forgot I was in pain. I just jumped up and ran back up the stairs, climbing onto the couch, trembling. I started to bawl once I caught my breath. Eventually, after I calmed down, I went and hid in my bedroom until my mother came back home. Not too long after they returned, I was bringing my great-grandmother a drink. When I went to hand it to her, she grabbed my wrist and told me, "I know what they did. The good ones told me. There are awful bad ones here, but they should leave you be now." She then released me and went back to just staring at her dolls. There is another event I can remember from my stay there. We had to go out of town for a funeral, and we were out of the house for 2 days. The night after we got back, I had a brand new sleeping bag, which I used to sleep in that same night. I was on the floor next to a dresser. A few hours after everyone had laid down, I was still awake, unable to go to sleep. I'd covered my head, hoping it would help me sleep, when I heard a sound. It was like a knock coming from behind the dresser. After a couple more of these knocks, I heard a male voice whisper, asking if I was awake. It did this a few times before I suddenly heard him whisper so close that I could feel breath on my ear. It caught me by surprise so much that I didn't hear what he said, just that he said it. Nothing happened in the last few days we were there, before going back with my dad. It would be years later that I found out from my mom that she had some things happen to her as well. One of the things she told me about was on the first night when we heard the footsteps in the hallway. After we'd gone to bed, she had gotten up to go to the bathroom. When she came back, she lay down and felt as if someone got into bed with her and cuddled up. She said the back half of her body was freezing, even though she had 2 blankets, and it was the middle of summer. Not just the back half, though. There was also a strip going across her waist. She said she lay there until the sun came up, when it finally disappeared. She also had frequent problems with setting down some item only to find it across the house in a different place where it had been. She told me how a few times when she was up late watching something, if she left the room, when she came back the TV remote would be sitting on the floor in the exact middle of the room. The last thing she told me about had me looking at everything in a different light. Apparently, my great-grandmother was well aware of everything going on in that house, so much so that she actually had a priest come down every 3 months to bless the place. The months that we had stayed there, the priest never made it down. He'd gotten sick and told my mom he would be there for his next scheduled time. He also told her to be careful because there was something terrible in that house and not to anger it. He learned that my brother and I would be staying there for those 3 months and told my mom to keep a very close eye on us. If we started to act weird or we started getting sick, she must call him so he could bless us. The last thing he told her before hanging up was, "There's something truly evil in that house, and it loves to prey on children." I was unsettled after hearing that. I constantly think back and try to remember what was told to me before I vowed never to set foot in that house again. All day, every day, also from no one. So I've told you about my fun summer at my great-grandmother's. Picking up from there, things became a roller coaster. From the ages of 7 to 14, my father, brother, and I moved around every 3 months. We stayed in the same town for a while, but eventually moved to others. We lived in hotels, trailer parks, apartments, with my dad's sister, his many girlfriends, and even homeless shelters. Though we moved around so much and stayed in many places, I still had encounters. It would always start slow. I would be by myself and hear someone walking around. In some of these places, I knew there were a lot of other people living there, so I would often write it off as just that. But there were a few times when I could not explain it away. One of those occasions, we were staying on the top floor. The other two went to have lunch in the dining room. I wasn't hungry, so I stayed back to draw and color. I then heard what sounded like someone walking up and down the hall. I was used to this. Some of these folks were major druggies. I stayed aware of it, but I wasn't too worried. This went on for about 10 minutes before I noticed that the sound no longer moved up and down the hallway. It had stopped right outside my door. These were small rooms with a bunk bed, an armchair, a closet, a bathroom that didn't have a shower, just a sink and toilet, and a small 2-foot counter. I didn't really have a place to hide, as everything was out in the open. If someone wanted to come in, all they had to do was turn the knob, as there were no locks on these doors. I sat there, in fear, alone with someone outside the door and nowhere to go. I stayed like that for about 5 minutes, scared out of my mind, when my brother suddenly burst through the door. I shot up, ready to run past him, and realized it was just him. He was red-faced, huffing and puffing since he had just been outside while our dad was smoking. I asked him if he was the one outside the door just now. He said, "No, I just got back inside. Dad's not too far behind me." I then asked if there was someone outside the door when he came up the stairs. He told me, "Nope, there wasn't even anyone in the hallway." I replied with a simple, "Okay," and sat back down. Another time at my aunt's house, I was home alone down in the basement playing the Wii. I was playing Dance Dance Revolution, so the TV volume was up pretty high. Then I heard a loud thump from the back of the basement, as if something large had fallen over. My aunt had 2 dogs, a Chihuahua named Daisy and a Golden Retriever named Ladybird. Daisy was next to me on the couch, so I assumed Lady had been getting into something she shouldn't have. I turned down the TV and went to see what she was doing. But then I heard her coming down the stairs. I waited for her before moving forward, letting her check it out first. She ran over to the corner and started to sniff the bookcase that had fallen over onto its side. This was a heavy wooden bookcase, filled with books and movies, now lying there. After she looked around a bit, I started to step forward to see what could have happened. Then she began to back up and get all defensive. I stopped, watching as the hairs on her neck stood right up and she stared into the corner. She then started to bark and growl at it, so I backed up too. She continued for a minute before her ears dropped and she began to cower. Suddenly, I heard loud running footsteps coming toward me. I froze, not knowing what to do. A large gust of freezing air rushed past me. I heard the footsteps go upstairs before they vanished. I sat down with both dogs in my arms, watching cartoons until someone got back home. These are just a couple of examples of the footsteps I experienced. This would go on for the first 2 weeks before it started to get worse. The second thing that would happen was knocking. It wasn't on the doors, but on the walls and windows. It always happened either behind me or across the room. It got to the point where I would avoid windows as often as I could. Also, objects would move. I'm not talking about things flying through the place, but more like when I sat something down in one place, I would have to go searching for it, finding it where it had no business being. I used to get upset with my brother, blaming it on him for the longest time, but he would deny it every time. The first time I believed him was when I sat down my deodorant in the living room where he was, and ran back to our room to get my brush. When I got back, the deodorant was gone. I was angry, demanding that he tell me where it was since we were going to be late. He said he hadn't even left the room. He was busy putting his shoes on. He didn't even know I'd put it in there. I went looking for it and found it back in the room, standing on the mattress where I'd just been. I hurried to finish and get out of there. This cycle repeated every time we moved. It got to the point where I was afraid to see what would happen if we stayed longer than we did. Well, I got to find out when my dad married someone, and we moved yet again to another town. The first place we moved into was an actual house with a big yard. Not surprisingly, the cycle started yet again. It started after the first 2 weeks of being there. By that time, I was used to it. It became part of my daily routine. We hit month 4 in that house, and the real show started. I began to hear people call my name. Sometimes it was close by, other times it sounded distant. It got to the point where I thought I was going crazy. One night, I woke up to a scratching sound. We had a black lab Doberman mix who slept with me. Being a dumb kid, I got up out of the bed and went over to my closet. I didn't turn on the light or anything. I just yanked the door open, and my dog ran out of the closet. She was pure black and weighed 140 pounds, so all I saw was this black mass rush past me. But then I heard a whisper saying, "Just in time." I ran to turn on the light, and I saw my dog by the door, wanting out of the room. I flung the door open and ran out with her. I then went to my brother's room, sleeping there for the rest of the night. Since then, I always sleep with all doors closed, preferably locked, including the closet. She couldn't have opened it on her own, nor could she have closed it. After a few nights of hearing noises in the closet, my brother finally switched rooms with me. Once we switched rooms, the noises in the room itself stopped. The last thing that happened in that house occurred in front of everyone, the only time others saw anything happen. My dad's wife and I were prepping food for a barbecue. I was cutting the vegetables. I was on the last one, which was the jalapenos. Without thinking, I rubbed my eye and of course it started to burn. I sat down the knife I was using and went to get a towel, hoping to remove whatever was on my skin. She was trying to help me get it off. When it finally stopped burning, I went back to finish my task, but the knife was gone. I looked around to see if I'd set it somewhere else, but I couldn't find it. I asked her if she had touched it and she said no, so I went to ask my dad and brother, who were in the living room. They both said no. Just then, my dad's wife came out of the kitchen to ask if they'd seen the knife, and at that moment, her dog came out of their master bedroom, holding the knife by the handle in her mouth. Dogs are not allowed in the kitchen, and they knew that. My dad also said he never saw the dog leave the room before that. They ended up divorcing, and we moved out a couple of weeks afterwards. I had my own Home Alone adventures. From Unknown User 2008. When I was a kid, well, a young teenager, I frequently spent my Saturday nights babysitting my siblings. As the eldest of 3, I assumed this responsibility with no pay nor thanks to speak of. It was simply expected of me, one of my contributions to the family. I babysat so frequently because, well, my parents needed it. They'd had marriage problems in the past, and their counselor told them they should go on a weekly date. You know, revive the magic, rekindle the flame, all that good stuff. Yeah, it sucked to be robbed of a weekend evening, but it wasn't much of a burden. My parents were happier than they'd been in ages, and they both seemed genuinely excited for date night each week. I would have rather been doing other things, of course, but I'd seen my aunt and uncle go through a nasty divorce a few years back, and I desperately wanted my parents to stay together. And so it was that on the night of December 3rd in the year 2006, I stood at the open front door of my secluded Colorado home, waving goodbye as my parents backed out of the icy driveway. "Drive safe," I called out, steam pouring from my mouth. I don't know if they heard me or not. I wrapped my arms around my torso in response to the wintry mountain air, entertaining myself for a few brief moments by watching my breath float away into nothing. And there truly was nothing around me. Not a car nor creature in sight. It wasn't long before I grew bored and turned back into the warm house, nose tingling from the chill. My siblings, Georgie and Kate, were eating their dinner at the kitchen table. As I watched them, I couldn't help but feel like an only child. Georgie was 3 years younger than me and was severely autistic and not very talkative. He only spoke when he really wanted something, and only then in the simplest of words, like milk and sandwich. That was code for peanut butter and jelly with the crust cut off, which he was presently devouring. Kate, meanwhile, was still a baby, just shy of 2 years old. The 9-year gap between them was glaring, but to this day, my parents swear to me Kate wasn't an accident. Kind of like back in high school when I swore to them I had no idea how those magazines got under my mattress. But I digress. The kids finished dinner, and I set them up with their entertainment for the night. Georgie in his room with the PlayStation 2, which was a hot commodity in those days, and Kate in her crib, in front of Sesame Street. As for me, I lit the basement fireplace, dimmed the overheads, and curled up with a book by the light of our Christmas tree. That was a nice house. Not a day goes by that I don't miss it. I read, in perfect contentment, for nearly an hour. It was after dark by then, and the room had become pretty toasty. I was beginning to doze off when I heard Georgie's heavy footfalls descend the staircase. I sat upright and looked at him expectantly as he waddled into the room. "No more knocking," he said, brow furrowed in annoyance. I shook my head. "I'm not knocking," I said. "Is someone at the door?" Georgie stared at me blankly. "Georgie, did someone knock on the door?" I asked again, trying to be more clear this time. "No more knocking," he repeated. "Knocking on window." Knocking on window? I stood up, now wide awake. "Georgie, is someone knocking on your window?" "No more," he replied simply. I stood in silence for a moment, unsure of what to do. It was probably just one of my friends playing a prank, I thought. But being alone in a house that big makes you a little jumpy. My mind started to race through the situation. I was a 13-year-old boy in a nice house on the hilly outskirts of a Colorado mountain town. The streets were engulfed in trees, and there were no homes within a quarter-mile of my own. Our road saw next to no traffic, and the police station was a good 15 minutes away. It was probably just my friends, I thought. But what if it wasn't? "Follow me," I told Georgie. My hands were trembling, and I turned the knob and glanced up the staircase. It was dark up there. The only light came from Kate's room. "Oh, Kate!" I sprinted up the stairs to her room, where she remained happily perched in her crib, squawking with delight as Elmo fiddled with his crayons. I breathed a sigh of relief, but still my heart thumped in my chest. "This is silly," I told myself. "Be a man." I made my way down the hall to Georgie's room, then stood tentatively at its door. Taking a deep breath, I gently pushed the door ajar, reaching for the light switch and thinking better of it. Because if this was the worst-case scenario, then I didn't want our mystery intruder to know where in the house I was. The only light in the room came from Star Wars Battlefront's game paused screen. I listened for a moment, but I heard nothing. I began to suspect that Georgie had simply imagined the knocking. Somewhat irritated, I moved to the window, and I flicked up a blind to reveal nothing. Just a landscape of freshly fallen snow backed by a quiet, lonely road. I watched the peaceful night for a moment, Relieved as the large flakes fell softly to the ground, my eyes followed them, only to find footprints beneath the window's frame. At first, I didn't comprehend what I saw. I just stared, transfixed, at the deep imprints in the snow. They were from shoes, a man's shoes. None of my friends wore shoes that size. Of that, I felt sure. I traced the steps backwards from the window to the sidewalk, from where this intruder had evidently come. But where did they lead? It was a bright night. The moon shone proudly between the clouds. My eyes followed the steps across the front yard, but once they passed behind the giant pine tree, they disappeared. My heart leapt to my throat. Whoever had walked behind that tree must still be there. In panic, I quickly backed away from the window. Georgie, sensing my fear, began to whimper. No. Shh, I muttered, desperate to keep him quiet. I flicked the television off, leading Georgie out of the room. I quickly pulled Kate from her crib, powering the TV down as well, and carried her down the stairs in the blackness. "Can't see," Georgie said, and Kate began to cry. I shushed her as we descended. Once in the basement den, I unplugged the Christmas tree, so that the only light in the room came from the embers of the dying fire. I sat Georgie down on the couch and settled Kate in his arms. "Sit right here," I directed, staring into his eyes. "Don't move. Do you understand? Do not move." I knew I needed to call the police. I would have called my parents, but this was a long time ago, so my parents weren't carrying cell phones. I took the stairs quickly and quietly, tiptoeing to the phone hanging from the wall of our living room. I picked up the phone and dialed 911, but I heard nothing. There was just silence. I slammed it on the receiver and picked it up again. Nothing, and again, nothing. I think it was around this point that I started to cry. I couldn't help it. I was scared. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself that the storm had killed the phone line. But there wasn't much of a storm. The snow was steady, sure, but there hadn't even been a breeze. Certainly nothing that could have disabled our phone. Tentatively, I walked into Kate's room and peeked out the window. My first glance was towards the tree, of course, where the footprints stopped. But now they continued. Someone, while I was herding my siblings downstairs, the person who had been behind the tree, had moved. I followed the footsteps across my frozen front yard to a man. He was standing near the driveway, looking right at me. He stood still, and so did I, as we silently stared for what seemed like an eternity. My heart thrummed in my chest and I felt nauseous. For the first time, gazing into this man's eyes from afar, I began to consider the possibility that I might die. I thought of my dad's brother, who was killed in an accident when he was 11. Forever 11, never growing up, frozen in time, in the memories of all who knew him, a soul of eternal youth. The tears began to flow freely then. "Please don't hurt us," I begged in a sobbing whisper. I knew he could not hear me, but I couldn't help myself. Finally, he broke eye contact with me and looked up toward the gently falling snow. He was saying something, but what I could not hear. I stared as he began to pull a handful of dark powder from his pocket. Then, still gazing upward, muttered to himself and flung the stuff to his feet. I desperately wanted to run, to get my siblings, but I thought to let this man out of my sight would be unconscionably foolish. No, I had to keep an eye on him. The house was still locked. I had the upper hand, I thought. Besides, I could not bring myself to look away from the strange ritual unfolding before me. The man had removed his sweater and flung it carelessly to the ground behind him. He was no longer staring skyward, but his lips continued to move. I trained my eyes intently upon his mouth, trying with no success to read his words, when I saw something glint in the moonlight. He had a knife, a long, callous blade which he had removed from his other pocket. It had dark stains already, but from what? I covered my mouth to hush a scream as the man, still muttering to himself, ran the edge of the blade along his pale, distended stomach. A thin red line appeared along his abdomen, and blood of the deepest shade began to dribble from the wound. The streams trickled down his belly and fell ungracefully upon the black powder at his feet. At this, the man stared skyward once more, face contorted in a gruesome smile. He was sobbing uncontrollably, and mucus ran freely from his nostrils. But he looked happy. Beyond happy even. Elated. My stomach churned in revulsion. This man was in pure ecstasy. I watched, almost entranced by this bizarre unfolding, when the man's face changed suddenly. He looked directly at me once more. His eyes appeared unhinged. Still clutching the knife, he began to sprint directly at my window. I took one look at the weapon this man brandished and instinctively fled the room. I slammed the door shut behind me and was halfway down the stairs when I heard the window shatter. The man screamed loudly in pain as I reached the basement. I locked the door behind me, running to Georgie and Kate. "No more screaming," Georgie pleaded. No more screaming," I agreed in hushed tones, stroking his hair, trying to calm him down. Kate, meanwhile, seemed happy as a clam. I strained and listened. Was he inside the house? I still clung to some naive hope that he had injured himself on the glass and would retreat. Or perhaps he had been weakened by his self-inflicted wound. Finally, I heard it. The subtle and unmistakable sound of footsteps upstairs. He was indeed inside our home, and by the sound of it, was trying his best to stay quiet. Silently, I guided Georgie and Kate into a storage closet and closed the door behind us, manipulating the handle to make as little noise as possible. We stayed there for about 5 minutes, listening to the ceiling creak threateningly above us. Then I realized, I don't know why it took me so long, that we were not trapped. We still had a way out. I saw in my mind's eye a window well, in the bathroom down the hallway, the only access our basement had to the outside world. Almost as if on cue, a frustrated scream echoed from above, followed by a tremendous crash. He had pulled something to the ground, perhaps the entertainment stand, or maybe the hutch.
"He's here! How dare you hide from him?"
The man shouted hysterically. To this day, I don't know who he was talking about. But it was at that moment I heard him beginning to descend the stairs. I made my move then. Holding Kate in one arm, guiding Georgie with the other, we began our flight down the hallway. As we reached the bathroom, I stared fixedly at the window near the ceiling. It would be a tight fit, but we could make it. I flung the window open, standing on the toilet, placing Kate gently in the shallow window well. Then I stepped off and told Georgie to get on. "Yucky, gross. No standing on toilet," he said, looking embarrassed. I heard the man fumble with the locked handle at the base of the stairs. Time was running out. I'm not proud of what I did next, but it was the only way I could think of to get Georgie to cooperate. I smacked my brother roughly across the face and grabbed him by the shirt with both hands. "Georgie, get on the freaking toilet," I snarled at him, the first time I'd ever said a curse word to him. He began to wail in pain and surprise, but he did as he was told, stepping onto the toilet all the same. "Climb out the window," I directed in a harsh tone, and as he grabbed the ledge, I used all the strength I could muster to help push him up. Once, he almost slipped back down. Almost, but he was stronger than I thought he was, and he managed to pull himself back up. With both my siblings safely in the window well, I climbed on the toilet one last time and gripped the edge of the windowsill. As I clambered out myself, I heard a raucous crash. The man had broken down the basement door. With one last hoist, I pulled my legs up through the window and shut it quietly behind me. As I helped my siblings out of the well, I heard one last anguished shout from the man, muffled through the pane of the glass.
"Why are you hiding from him?"
"Cold," screamed Georgie as I led him barefoot over the snowy ground. In a panic, I shushed him, but it was no use. He and Kate were both crying quite loudly by this point. My only hope was to get them as far away from the house as I possibly could. I heard a distant crash from inside, and I quickened our pace. My feet became numb, and I sprinted through the yard to the sidewalk, practically having to drag Georgie onto it. "Bathroom light on," he said pleadingly. He was obsessive about turning off lights and electronics before leaving a room. And he was correct. We had left the bathroom light on in our haste. I ignored him and rushed us down the frozen pavement, stepping on sharp rocks and sticks, not even noticing it. Adrenaline surged through my veins. I didn't know what we were headed towards. All I knew is what we were headed away from. The snow was falling much harder by this point. I could already see it collecting in a pile on Kate's head. Her nose was beet red and dripping with snot. I had to get her inside. But where? I looked ahead and I saw a light in the distance. The Garland's house. I'd said maybe a grand total of 6 words to Mr. and Mrs. Garland my entire life. But that was our only option. If we could get into their house, we could be safe. My house was now around the corner and out of sight, but I didn't let up the pace until Georgie tripped on something and landed in a dark puddle. "Hey!" he screamed indignantly. In the glow of the distant streetlight, I could see that Georgie had fallen into blood. The motionless form of a man lay face up, eyes open, on the sidewalk. Snow had fallen onto most of him, and he'd been mostly invisible until Georgie's feet had connected with his midsection. I remembered the dark stain I'd seen on our intruder's knife. "Come on," I pled, wrenching my eyes away from the scene as I pulled Georgie to his feet. We ran for another 60 seconds maybe, finally reaching the Garland's front door. The window into their parlor was open and a fire was roaring. Mr. and Mrs. Garland sat drinking tea in cozy armchairs. I pounded ferociously on their door. They answered together, utter bewilderment stamped on their faces. I handed Kate to Mrs. Garland and collapsed into tears. The police arrived at my home 15 minutes later. They apprehended the man, who was now unconscious, lying in a crumpled heap on the floor of our basement bathroom. They discovered him there with a fractured skull, many deep lacerations from the window of Kate's room, and intestines partially protruding from the wound of his gut. He had slipped in his attempt to climb where he had climbed, hitting his head and knocking himself out. Apparently, he confessed under questioning that he was a member of a strange cult, a cult which, as far as anyone can tell, doesn't even exist. He claimed to have been taking part in a ritual which required the sacrifice of a pure soul, and my autistic brother had been his target that night. My parents have not shared with me all the details of what happened after that night. but as far as I know, our intruder is currently rotting in a cell. The man he had killed, the man we found lying on the sidewalk, was a friend of my father who lived 2 streets over. He had called his wife on his cell phone not long before he died, informing her of a suspicious man dressed in black stalking around the neighborhood. My parents arrived home from their date to find police swarming around the block and their home a crime scene. My father ended up relocating at work, and we moved across the Rockies to Salt Lake City just 2 weeks later. Nowadays, Kate is a bratty middle schooler. As far as I'm concerned, she's perfect. Georgie, now 21, hasn't changed a bit, but he loses his mind if someone knocks on a window. As for me, I'm a bit of an adrenaline junkie. I climb mountains with narrow trails and steep ridges. I go cave diving in places where you really shouldn't. I can't help but wonder, maybe I'm trying to relive that intensity of that one night so long ago. It never really works. Still, the scariest thing to me is being alone in my room in the dead of night, because it reminds me of what nearly happened to us. It tried to imitate our dogs. From Shady German. I was 15 years old at the time. My friend, I'll call him T, was 17. I have lived in Germany all my life, and I still live near the woods. I have a dog named Lenny, and he also had a dog. His was named Inna. I live in a 2-story house, and my window faces the forest. It was November of 2023. I was home alone, save for my friend T. Our dogs were outside in my garden, as they usually were. It was around 7 p.m. T and I were watching TV. Suddenly, the happy barking from outside began to sound aggressive, scared even, or protective. "What's up with the dogs?" I asked. "I don't know," T replied. "Let's go outside and check." So we went outside. We found our dogs growling and barking towards the forest. "Lenny, get over here," I yelled. But he didn't respond. He just kept on barking. And even after T tried to call Inna back, neither of the dogs reacted. They wouldn't even look at us. T went up to Inna and tried to pull her by the collar, but stopped dead in his tracks while looking at the tree line in the forest. I wondered what was going on, so I cautiously went up to him to see what he was looking at. Then I saw them. There were our dogs at the tree line, but we knew that those weren't our dogs, because our beloved dogs were the ones barking at these dogs. These copy dogs looked off. My border collie has one brown eye and one blue eye, but this similar-looking imposter had 2 pitch-black eyes and was much larger. T's dog was a French bulldog, white and brown. But this other creature was black and white, also with pitch-black eyes and much bigger. They just stared at us. "Dude, what in the world are those?" I whispered urgently. "I have no idea. We need to get back inside. Slowly, though," T answered. So we did just that. We managed to pull our dogs back in. We put them on leashes and secured them to a wall so they couldn't run away. We locked all the doors and windows. When we looked back outside, the so-called dogs were gone. "Fenya, let's call our parents," T suggested. I wasted no time. Our parents arrived immediately. They went outside, armed. We even heard a struggle and a blood-curdling scream, but we were never told what happened. We never did speak of it again, and these days I'm scared to look outside my window. I always keep my curtains closed. The Little Girl and Her Red-Eyed Father. From TKNOVRGRL. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, my family lived in a duplex. I remember, every night, this little girl would sit at the end of my bed. My parents could even hear me laughing, but when they peeked into our room, there was no one else there, so they thought I was just playing instead of sleeping. Eventually, they decided to set up a camera. Not to catch a ghost or anything, but to catch which kid was sneaking food at night. But what they caught wasn't what they were expecting. From what they recall, when they reviewed the footage one night, they saw the figure of a little girl about my age at the end of my bed. They even watched her, tickling me and making me laugh. After that incident, she made herself more known. One day while we were at school, my mom was home alone, and she began to hear a little girl singing from the closet. She thought that one of us had skipped school, so exasperated she went upstairs to the closet, where the singing was coming from. She walked over to the closet, slammed open the door, but there was no one inside. Eventually, the little girl stopped sitting at the end of my bed. Instead, she seemed to have been replaced by a man with these red eyes. This man, I think, was the father of the little girl. But unlike the laughter and joy that the girl had brought me, this man filled me with nothing but terror. He never messed with anyone else but me. Later on in life, I learned a little history about the house. Before we lived there had been a fire. The father, mother, and daughter of the home died in the fire. Luckily for me, back in the day when this was happening, once I saw the man, the little girl came back. But eventually we moved out, and it seems those spirits never followed us. Thank you all for tuning in to another episode of Unexplained Encounters. I'm looking for more middle-of-nowhere stories next, so if you've got any scary, unexplained experiences that involve being in the middle of nowhere, send them to me at darkstories.org. If you haven't heard, I made my own tabletop card battling game called Cryptid, the creepy card battling game. You can check it out at cryptidcardgame.com. Pre-orders are actually open right now. We'll be shipping in late October. For updates on that and more, you can follow me on Twitter, or X I guess, at Prevails. In fact, I made a little tweet the other day, and I wanted to read it to you with some of the replies, as I thought they were kind of cool. I posted, "What age did your parents let you watch horror movies?" At Fields_Ashley said, "My husband waited for his son to turn 12. He turns 12 this Friday, and they'll start out with Late Night with the Devil. I can't say how old I was when I got into horror, because I can't recall." At Wintergirl_93 said, "When I was little, LOL, between my mom and my grandma, I was watching Tales from the Crypt, Are You Afraid of the Dark, The Shining, Rose Red, and Goosebumps. My mom told me that the characters are actors, it wasn't real, and they had to go home at the end of the day." At Kage Yurei says, "Watched them with my dad since I was little," or that's what he said. "For some reason, as a little kid, I preferred certain types of horror over cartoons, and it stuck with me up until my 30s. Now it's a good way to remember him by. He was killed when I was in my early teens." At Super Absurdist said, "Watching Poltergeist is actually my earliest memory when I was about 3. My mother took me to go see A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge, when I was 5 or 6. And at Nature's Temper replied, "As early as I can recall movies, I've watched horror. My parents are pretty neat." That's all I'll read here. It's pretty cool to hear people's experiences with horror films. I think it's neat how scary movies bring people together and help make fond memories. Anyway, if you want to hear all EerieCast shows without ads, plus a couple of exclusive scary audiobooks, consider becoming an EerieCast Plus member at eeriecast.com/plus. And if you want some merch from my show, or one of your other favorite EerieCast shows, go to eeriecast.store. Finally, I'm bringing back Brintendo, my gameplay channel. I renamed it Darkness Plays. It's in the style of Oni Plays, and you can watch it on Spotify actually, and YouTube, or just sit back and listen on your favorite podcast platform. Until next time, everyone, stay safe out there and stay creepy, because this world is a strange one.